Hölgyeim és uraim, jó reggelt kívánok! Sajnos, ahogy elképzelheted, nem beszélek magyarul. Ezért az előadást angolul fogom tartani. So, nagyon sajnálom, but now I have no choice. I have to switch to English. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And there are tons of things to say, so let me before I do, let me say a couple things about the speech and about the presentation. I think next, yeah, I'll do it like this. The slides are only intended as a compact summary of what I'm going to say. So the line of argument, with what little nuance I'll try to build into it, this is in the talk itself, right? So this is just to help fix ideas, and I hope to be able to provide more substance in what I'm going to be saying orally. So let me start with the word linguicism. Linguicism is a major concern of linguistic human rights, but it's usually considered to fall outside the scope of my field, which is the evaluation of language policy and planning, or language policies in general. There is a bit of a disconnect between the two. And why do we have this disconnect? Simply because on the one side, LPP, language policy and planning, suggests a more or less direct reference to the concepts and tools that have been developed over time to weigh the advantages and the drawbacks of alternative policies, in particular public policies in the context of liberal democracies. You know, if you don't have this sort of broad framework, there is no sense in analyzing policies. You analyze policies if you want to weigh the pros and cons. If you've got a dictator who decides, you don't have to analyze things. And on the other side, you have linguicism, which may lead to slow or to quick linguicide, but linguicism as such is generally considered as incompatible with the principles of liberal democracy. So the two things are kind of separate. Either you worry about linguistic human rights, linguicism, etc., or you work on public policy evaluation applied to language, and the two things do not meet very often. But I think it's interesting to take a closer look at the intersection between them, ponder the reasons that societies may have for not adopting policies that would lead intentionally or sometimes not intentionally to hard or soft linguicide. And this, of course, raises the question of the drawbacks of various language policy scenarios. And, you know, the general question is, how can we identify and measure these advantages and drawbacks? And even before that, another even more general question arises. How do we know if we have more or less linguistic diversity? How do we define and measure linguistic diversity? And depending on how we define it and how we measure it, what are the implications for language policy choices? And I'm talking here both about the language policy choices that we can make as a society, or those that we, all of us, can be led to recommend as scholars and analysts. So these are the questions at the end and at the heart of this talk. Now, because of this emphasis, my approach, I think, departs quite a bit from much of the discourse in applied linguistics and sociolinguistics. I'm an economist by training, as has just been mentioned. And now the fact that it's a bit different doesn't imply disagreement, doesn't imply position, but my point rather is that different perspectives on linguistic diversity can complement each other. They just have a different focus. So let me try to move to the next one. Yes. So the core questions are here. And again, you know, this is just a tight summary. I will try to go into a bit more nuance and detail during my talk, starting with a little bit of reflection about the meaning of LHR. What are LHR? What are linguistic human rights? And that's a topic which brings us together here. And what I contend is that the linguistic human rights is not exactly what we would call a paradigm, but it's a springboard, and pretty good springboard at that. I think LHR, linguistic human rights, is essentially an approach or an angle that we can use, among other approaches, to study linguistic diversity or to study the suppression of linguistic diversity through linguicide. LHR has been around for some, well, roughly 40 years. We often associate it with the names of the late Tove Skutnap-Kangas, thanks, and her husband, Robert Philipson. And I think many of us here have had the opportunity and the privilege to work with Tove and with Robert. Now, when saying that LHR is an angle, I'm not calling it a paradigm. That's on purpose, because a paradigm in its standard sense denotes, well, you've got a couple of words hidden there, but principles, theories, methods. Sometimes people also throw in values that define a specific approach, and this approach can then be used to understand and explain a certain group or class of phenomena. And typically the disciplines in the social sciences and humanities, which, by the way, I will sometimes call SSH, these disciplines are characterized by a paradigm, a specific paradigm, which is often centered on a very central notion, typically power, if you do political science, scarcity, if you work with economics, space, if you work for geography, groups, if you work as a sociologist, etc. So you have a collection of paradigms, and I think LHR, linguistic human rights, isn't quite a paradigm. It comes very close, but it's not quite a paradigm for two main reasons. First, because I think LHR per se is already a vantage point, a position from which you look at various things. And from this position, you already integrate the inputs from various disciplines which have their specific angle. And in addition to this, LHR is associated not only with research, but also with advocacy on behalf of ideals like the promotion of multilingualism, the protection of non-dominant languages, etc. And in fact, I believe it is precisely this dual nature of LHR that makes it both stimulating and relevant. I frankly like its capacity to encourage what we might call an organic analytical set of connections, or a set of organic connections, possibly, among many disciplines in the social science and humanities, combining sociolinguistics, education sciences, psychology, economics, law, political science. All these things are brought in. And if you look at the latest, the big book that you may remember, the Linguistic Human Rights Handbook that came out 3 years ago, it does have a lot of things from various disciplines into it. And LHR is a very organic way to combine them. And second, I think it's useful as a kind of compass, and I'm using the word on purpose, a compass for analyzing and diagnosing real-world language problems. Now, these two features are well, that's a bit, I'm jumping ahead of a little bit there. These two features explain, I think, why LHR is a very good source of ideas for the study of linguistic diversity. And this is what LHR is good for, provides lots of ideas and combines lots of inputs. And on the other hand, LPP, language policy and planning, is, of course, a very good instrument for the governance of linguistic diversity. As a hyperonym, as a word that combines, that encompasses both societal multilingualism and individual plurilingualism. So when I say linguistic diversity, I mean these two things at the same time. So with this brief words of introduction, we've sketched out a set of connections between LHR, linguicide, linguistic diversity, plurilingualism, multilingualism, language policy, and planning. So we see that all those concepts are interrelated. They can be used together in combination to think about linguistic diversity and act upon linguistic diversity in a certain way. And let's take a closer look at the partnership between LHR and LPP, linguistic human rights and language policy and planning, which is largely where I come from. So LPP can mean lots of different things nowadays. And I think the reason for this is that the emergence, since the emergence of LPP, roughly in the 1960s, as an identifiable endeavor, it has developed along very different lines. And to keep things simple, we can, look at this sort of more or less ordered list, or if you want, an arborescence of how it has developed. There is a classical LPP, which we associate with people like Fishman and other big classical names. And then there is contemporary LPP, which has branched off in several directions or orientations. Within the language disciplines, you have, I think, 3 subsets. A continuation of the classical approach, and this means, lots of people that we know. We could mention people like Joe Lobianco, Tom Risento, Jeroen Darken, possibly people like Yuri Nekvapil, Conrado Gilligan, Catherine Yu, etc. And then there are some more applied linguistic approaches, which themselves tend to present themselves as belonging to either an interactionist orientation or more ethnographic one, although I think the 2 are slightly different, but they're very close. And then you have, in my opinion, a separate sub-branch called critical sociolinguistics. Critical sociolinguistics, which sets great store by questions of power and how language and language policies can serve or can be used to reproduce power. It's more about discourse about language policies than language policies themselves. One of my reservations about critical sociolinguistics is that I think it was Dan Sperber who once said that it's talk about talk about talk, and that may be uncharitable, because I think there is a usefulness to critical sociolinguistics, but critical sociolinguistics addresses policy, language policy, in a very indirect or meta-level way. And apart from what you've had in the language disciplines, you have another perspective, which is the one that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about today, which is language LPP, language policy and planning, as a form of public policy. And that is a bit further away from the language disciplines, but it is closer to what you have in social sciences like political science, economics, etc. This second orientation prioritizes questions that are directly linked to governance, including questions that had already been raised in the classical tradition by people like Fishman and others. And our recently published handbook, the Routledge Handbook of Language Policy and Planning, which has come out a year and a half, 2 years ago, is very much about this. It's 600 or 700 pages long. I didn't bring it with me, but it's a bit heavy to carry around. But it really sort of provides an overview of this more social science-oriented perspective on language policy and planning. So I would like to, locate my presentation in this perspective and use this to think a bit more in depth about the reciprocal need between LHR and LPP. Now, one of the very strong suits of LHR is that it helps us quickly diagnose many language problems. I think it's particularly good at identifying and unpacking situations that are unsatisfactory for normative reasons. And this means situations that are unsatisfactory because there is a discrepancy between how things are and how we consider that things should be. So this can be very useful. But the fact that it's useful doesn't mean that it's enough. And that's one of the problems, I think, with LHR. LHR, I think, is not enough because of its heavy reliance on normativity, that is, on values and preferences, which are unfalsifiable in the Popperian sense. And a discourse that rests on unfalsifiable notions like good or bad essentially only works with people who already share the same values, or who can be persuaded through argument to share those values. But it's pretty useless with people who do not and will not share your values. This is, I think, true in matters of language and culture. And in this area, irreconcilable positions are not uncommon. We've got tons of examples throughout history, but just to clarify what I'm talking about, in our day and age, we can think about, well, first, what's the appropriate place of immigrant languages in a host society? And that may be Spanish in Pennsylvania, it may be Arabic in the Netherlands, Lingala in South Africa, Turkish in Germany. Let's keep going. For another example, how much support should be granted to the languages of traditional minority communities from the Maori in New Zealand, Tuvan in the Russian Federation, Friulian in Italy, and so on and so forth, right? Tons of things there. Or is it all right for university professors in Sweden or France, possibly also Hungary and Romania, by the way, to require their PhD students to write their dissertations in English? And if so, shouldn't university profs in the US accept dissertations in Swedish or French or Romanian or Hungarian? Some people believe that the ongoing Russification of the Belarusian education system is for the good of the country, but many citizens of Belarus think precisely the opposite. So the list of questions on which there is disagreement is endless. But even if there is some agreement, or even if there is full agreement on values and policy goals, then we still may have disagreements about how we achieve those goals, even if we have agreed on those goals. So in order to develop a sound language policy, here's a bit of an overview. I should have shown that before, sorry. So these are the limitations of LHR. This is why LHR needs to be operating in conjunction with LPP and vice versa, because LHR offers a compass and LPP provides a map. LHR provides a compass in terms of, well, where do we want to get to? And LPP provides a map. How exactly do we get there? And here I'm tempted to quote something, I'll try to do it by heart, from Fishman, 1989, who said, well, he was referring to one particular type of policy, the policies that are aimed at preserving, protecting, promoting small languages, minority languages. And he said, well, that means rowing against the current. And it is hard enough to row against the current. It's difficult in the first place, but it's nearly impossible if you don't know where you want to get to and why. And I think he was already back then making reference to this complementarity between the compass and the map. So having set the stage with these general considerations about LHR and LPP, I'd like to focus on something more specific, namely, what is diversity? How do we identify it? How do we measure it? And why it matters? The vast majority of human societies, as we know, is linguistically and culturally diverse. And one of the most basic questions that we have to deal with is how to manage this diversity. People have different profiles, which sometimes means different expectations, different interests, different dreams, different visions of the good life. So how do we work through that? Answering this question means that we have to deal with it through policy. There is no such thing as no language policy. The state can stay out of religion. The state cannot stay out of language. And let's consider 3 examples. First is the bilingualization or the multilingualization of the education system in a multilingual country, moving from just one language of instruction to separate streams with different languages of instruction, in order to know how much this is going to cost, starting from one language of instruction, but duplicating or reduplicating the education system, you have to know how much diversity you have. Another example, why it's important to know how much you have, is immigrant integration programs in multilingual or multicultural cities. Suppose that a country that contains several highly multilingual cities as a result of immigration wants to enable city authorities to set up integration programs for these various immigrant communities. This means allocating subsidies, but how much are you going to allocate to what city? And for this, you need to have some kind of reliable information about how much diversity you have, because it's going to affect the total expenditure to the central state for such programs, for the subsidies to such programs, and then how much each multilingual city will receive in subsidies. For a third example, I think it's important to have a good instrument to monitor the dynamics of language, the change from T to T+1 and beyond. That can mean monitoring language shift or maintenance, and possibly detect situations of soft linguicide, that may not be obvious at first sight. So it's essential in this case to be able to have a good tool to measure linguistic diversity. The three examples are here, and again, we can go later into detail if you wish, but I don't want to go into too much technical detail now. For example, on the bi or multilingualization of the education system, whose cost can be captured by a relatively compact formula. We'll get to this later if you so desire. Now, how much diversity do we have? Oh, sorry, it doesn't. It looks a bit different on my computer. Sorry for stepping over the frame. But how much diversity do we have? Now, apparently easy answer is to say, oh, let's just count how many languages are spoken in this city or in this country. Well, that's a start, but it's not enough, obviously, because of course there's always a large number of languages present, and which languages should we include in the count for the purposes of language policy? There can easily be a dozen type of situations, and I'm not going to go through these various categories, but even if you say, oh, we're just going to count the languages, well, which languages are we going to count? All of them, some of them, they're permanently, not permanently, they're for a long time, not for such a long time. This is already a pretty big question. For the purposes of public policy, it is often relevant, not always, but it is often relevant to say, all right, we're going to worry about the languages that are spoken natively as an L1 by citizens. But even this is a bit tricky, particularly situations of minority language transmission, which, as you know, give rise to doubts about, well, what is exactly a person's L1, for example, with a mixed language family, etc. Anyway, that's referring to L1, people's first language or native language, is only one possible convention, and the quantification of diversity may extend to other of those categories. It may extend, for example, to the languages spoken by immigrants, what is sometimes called heritage languages, including people who have not or perhaps not yet acquired citizenship. That's not an easy question, even if you simply count, if you add. And let me note in passing that the LHR literature, linguistic human rights literature, isn't very helpful there about which languages to include or not to include for policy purposes. If I need answers to this, I ask lawyers, because they usually, what I find is that the LHR literature can be a little bit elusive and sometimes lack in criteria which don't have to be absolute. They can be conditional, but they have to be spelled out logically, which I think is not the strongest point in the LHR literature. So counting languages is something which is known in the literature as richness. Richness is the number of languages present, and depending on how you handle the list that you have there, that can mean a greater or a lower number of languages. So richness, as you can see here, is N, the number of languages present. But of course, that is usually not a very good vision, not a very good representation, because some languages weigh a lot, others weigh very little. And this is why other indices or indexes have been developed. The best known may be the Greenberg Index G, right, after the name of Joseph Greenberg, who in the 1950s was the professor of linguistics at Stanford University, and said, well, let's simply take 1 minus the sum of the squares of the percentages of that each group represents. And that's going to help us make the difference between two situations, one where you have 4 language groups that make up 25% of the population each, and one where you have 4 language groups as well, so the same richness, but one weighs 94% and all the others weigh 2% each. Same richness, 4, but it means completely different realities. And this is captured in the Greenberg Index, because the Greenberg Index in one case is going to be worth 0.75, and in the other case is going to be is going to be 0.12. So that's why, we need to go beyond just counting languages and use an index. Greenberg is an improvement. The problem with Greenberg's is that whereas richness overemphasizes very tiny languages, the Greenberg index does the opposite. It downplays diversity. A better solution is Shannon entropy, which is the third of these. We don't really have the time to discuss this one. It falls somewhere in between. It's slightly better. And then we have something called the numbers equivalent, which has been developed in the environmental sciences, which is a transformation of these indices. You can transform any of these with the numbers equivalent. And that has several mathematical properties that are pretty helpful for counting diversity. And we're going to move to one of these properties in a moment. But essentially, let's remember that we need to count diversity. We've got several ways to count diversity. These several ways are enshrined in indexes, which each of them has advantages and drawbacks. Now, that's a good start. But we probably need to go even further than this. We need to go even further than this because space isn't uniform. And that's something that people working in environmental sciences have, I think, done very useful work about. And that's work that we can import when dealing with linguistic diversity from an LHR perspective or from an LPP perspective, or when combining the two. Space isn't uniform. And in the environmental sciences, the question has come to the fore when they first started to quantify biophysical diversity in a given area. How many animal or vegetal species do we have there? Is area A, for example, more or less diverse than area B? Now consider, for example, a mountain valley. A mountain valley contains different spots or different milieus. We often call them milieus, different configurations, different habitats. We often call them habitats, as we will see, because these are home to different collections of vegetal and animal species. Now, typically, if you have a mountain valley, in fact, I live half of my time in a mountain valley at an altitude of 1,400 meters, so I see this, pretty much constantly. And typically, if you want to define the diversity in a place like this, you're going to say, well, we've got at least 5 different milieus defined by altitude: hilly, mountainous, subalpine, alpine, and snowy, the further up you go. But that's not the only thing that defines the range of species you're going to encounter. What also matters is, humidity level, exposure to sun and wind, type of soil, proximity to human activity, etc., etc. These are homes. This creates separate spaces and this impacts on the range of animal and vegetable species, that you will find in these milieus. So just one measure is not going to be enough. It's just one measure of how many species do we have? Well, it depends. In this part of the valley, at this altitude, with this kind of exposure to sun and humidity, we're going to get this collection, and there we're going to get that collection. So we need, in fact, 2 things. We need to count the diversity of elements, which is usually called alpha diversity in the environmental sciences, but we also need to count the diversity of contexts or habitats in which these elements live. And this is called beta diversity. And total gamma diversity is the product of the 2, alpha and beta. And in order to have certain mathematical properties for this, you need to use, and we won't go into detail now, you need to use what we have just called the numbers equivalent of one of the indexes that we've just seen. So how does this translate into our ways to approach, count linguistic diversity and possibly act upon it. And let me try, because we don't have lots of time, let me try to use a couple of, a pretty simple analogy. London, the city of London, London, the big city, I'm not talking about the heart, just, London as an agglomeration is a multicultural city with every possible choice of ethnic restaurant. But you can say the same of Paris, New York, Berlin, Brussels, Amsterdam, Barcelona, Los Angeles, Singapore, and increasingly you can say that about less cosmopolitan cities too. These cities are, with globalization, becoming increasingly diverse, but in many ways, their diversity is increasingly similar. Paradoxically, the rise of internal diversity within each city may reduce the differences between cities, and it may lead to a form of bland folklorization of languages and cultures, which will be found in just about every city in a rather predictable mix. So in a given space, the diversity stemming from the variety of species or languages, which we call alpha, or intra-element diversity, is one thing. But then you also have the diversity stemming from the variety of habitats or regions or cities called beta, or inter-element diversity. And again, total diversity is going to be the product of the two. So this very much converges with this classical idea that comes from a field of research orientation called the ecology of language, associated with the names of people like Peter Muehlhäusler and other people who worked on language ecology. Except it takes it a little bit further by trying to give a formalized expression to it, which in turn enables us to derive some implication. So a multilingual country with different locations, different provinces, or even different cities. So let's assume that each of these locations is diverse itself. But in order to have genuine diversity, each location should be differently diverse. It should be diverse in its specific way. And it must have its specific profile with a specific combination of languages and cultures, just like the diversity of a mountain valley is going to be made up of different habitats, which are differently diverse. So by pushing alpha, if we are, and that is sometimes one of the weaknesses of the LHR perspective, a strong insistence on diversity because diversity is good. I believe diversity is good. I like it. I wouldn't be doing this job otherwise. I started this job because of an interest in Celtic languages, right? As an economist, it wasn't an obvious connection to make. But anyway, I like diversity. But then, if you're really concerned about diversity, we must approach it with care, because it does not necessarily mean at all times and in all places maximizing it. It must be done in a relatively, I think, subtle and differentiated way. If we just push alpha, this doesn't have to, but it may undermine beta. And ultimately, this may compromise gamma. Remember, the total diversity is gamma, is alpha times beta. If you push alpha, you may end up with the predictable forms of identical diversities, which reduces gamma and unbalance the effect, reduces beta, and unbalance the effect on gamma is a bit ambiguous. So the idea is to avoid that linguistically all cities or all provinces or all places are diverse in the same way. They have to be diverse in their specific way, which is historically, culturally anchored. And this is something that can be terribly difficult to accept from an LHR perspective. I can remember if Tove Skutnap-Kangas, whom some of us may remember, may have met. If Tove was there, we probably, we were good friends, really very good friends, loved her. But we probably would get into an argument over this, because I would say, well, let's be careful about what we push for diversity and where we push what components of diversity. And I would like to clinch this point in conclusion with an example from my own country, Switzerland. Now, as you know, we've got 4 national languages, of which 3, German, French, and Italian, are official at the federal level. Romansh, which is our 4th national language spoken by roughly 50,000 people, is a bit of a special case, right? Let me emphasize, by the way, that English is not and has never been one of the official languages of Switzerland. Now, each part of Switzerland is associated with one and only one official language, with a very small clutch of exceptions. This is what we call territoriality. We have pretty stiff territoriality in Switzerland. Some countries are even stiffer than that in this respect, but not many are. So territoriality carries as an implication that at the local level, in one specific place, some languages are excluded, not included. And many people consider this surprising, but in certain circumstances, which have a long history behind them, as in Switzerland, that ultimately helps preserve linguistic diversity. And it's part of an arrangement that, in that case, let me emphasize, and I will emphasize again, in that case, has proved to be, over several centuries and in international comparison, a reasonably successful way of managing linguistic diversity. We run into regular crises. We are going through one of those crises right now. We can talk about it more if you want. But by and large, over time, it has not worked too badly. And there is about this a very interesting court case that dates back to 2012, so a little over 12 years ago. I'd like to tell you a bit more about this to illustrate it. It comes from the Italian-speaking part of the country, which largely, though not fully, coincides with the southern canton of Ticino. And in that part of the country, the school system operates in Italian, and in Italian only. There is no right to instruction in another language, including the other national languages of Switzerland. I'll come from the French-speaking part. There is no right to instruction in German. In the German-speaking part, there is no right to instruction through the medium of French. However, parents may put their child, if they so wish, in a private school that offers instruction through the medium of another language than the locally official one. So there is the case of one family who had chosen in Ticino, and the Italian-speaking part, to enroll their child in a private school, a bit expensive one, where the teaching was in English. And after, I think it was 3 years, the local authorities told the parents that they must pull their child out of that school and that they must school their child in an Italian medium school. Or leave, accused, and they appealed the decision. And the case right to decide that after a maximum of 3 years, that in language policy and education policy are primarily a responsibility of the cantons, of which we have 26. Cantonal authorities have the right, if they want, they don't have to, but if they want, they have the right to insist on the prevalence of the locally official language, and in that case, it was Italian. And the federal tribunal explicitly motivated its decision by referring to the territoriality principle, which is enshrined in the federal constitution. We've got 3 successive constitutions with 2 revisions, so let's say we've got 5 since 1815. Because territoriality is an essential safeguard of Switzerland's historical and, in many ways, definitional linguistic diversity. So let me conclude. The slide on the screen sums up to this talk. I won't repeat them now, except for the last one. protecting and promoting diversity can imply, somewhat paradoxically, restricting alpha diversity in order to guarantee that different locales, different places, different habitats are differently diverse, and which is a condition for real overall diversity. And this understanding of diversity can be of help to protect diversity, as I've tried to show in using the example of that Swiss court ruling. In addition, because it protects the specificity of different locations, it contributes to protecting people's sense of space, and this can usefully defuse xenophobic tensions, or generally tensions related to how we deal with linguistic otherness, with cultural difference, etc. Having a sense of place is maybe important to avoid that, all the more so because the enemies of democracy are currently trying to undermine democracy using this sort of thing, which is why I think it is supremely important to develop a not far right, but also not far left, a centrist discourse, a politically centrist discourse on diversity, on linguistic and cultural diversity, and to do this with good instruments. Let's remember in closing that anywhere in the world, each situation is unique. And the implementation of an alpha, beta, gamma approach, as I've tried to present here, an alpha, beta, gamma approach to the governance of diversity must take into account the specific political and cultural and historical context within which linguistic human rights are deployed and must be defended. Now, all this reminds us of one of the things that makes the governance of linguistic diversity such an endlessly fascinating topic. Because in addition to being a matter of social responsibility, it is also, I think, one of the most stimulating intellectual adventures that we can hope for. So this is essentially wanted to say, to summarize this presentation. We can go into further detail. I know that I've been quite, skimmed kind of fast on, through lots of topics. Here are some sources that make it possible to go more in depth on various aspects of this talk. If those of you who are interested are welcome to get in touch by email, and I'll do my best to answer questions later on, not just today, where of course I'm ready to answer some questions, but later on in the future, if you wish. Sometimes you just have to send me 2 or 3 emails until I react. That's right. But anyway, thank you very much, because I think I'm done. So thank you for your attention. Köszönöm szépen. Mulțumesc. Merci de votre attention.